So, Anna is here to offer us a wealth of experience and expertise in grief recovery. She is a certified life coach and a grief recovery specialist. She hosts a grief recovery program and has served as a distinguished speaker at statewide conferences and contributed to enlightening panel discussions. Her advocacy and knowledge in the realm of grief recovery is a testament to her dedication and passion to helping others navigate their journey of healing through grief and life's challenges. So, in her presentation, Anna will delve into the profound influence on grief on one's mental well-being and share insightful strategies to break free from the emotional inertia often associated with grief. So her words will serve as a source of inspiration, encouraging her audience to embark on a unique and transformative life path, rediscover a deep and meaningful sense of purpose, and ignite the sparks of joy that life holds in abundance. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this off to Anna. Again, please keep your microphones muted. If you have any questions, type them in the chat. If you have any answers to the interactive portions of this, please type them in the chat. I will be reading them to Anna. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Allie. I am quite honored to share just a glimpse into the work that I do. And I want to add that my work is really centered around the things that I have experienced personally. And so you'll hear me reference those things all throughout. And I will begin simply by inviting you into some of the experiences that I have had as a part of our conversation tonight. So I want to share that my first panic attack happened during my tenure in corporate America. I've had two near-death experiences, one at gunpoint and the other at the birth of my last child. I am a one-time divorcee and currently happily married for 29 years. I have lost two fur babies, our dogs, and I've retired from corporate America. I've had children to leave home for college with the likelihood of not returning to strike out on a life of their own and make their way in the world. And I would like to ask the audience, what do all of these things have in common? So you can drop your response in the chat box. What do all these life experiences that I just spoke about have in common? I would also like to add that my mother died in 2015, and 2 years later, my father died. What do all these things have in common? And the second question I'll ask as we begin our time together tonight is, what is grief? What is grief? How would you define grief? What is it? So as you drop those comments in the chat box, we will circle back to those in just a little while. And before we go any further, I would like to say that one of the things that I have grown accustomed to is honoring my ancestors as I talk about grief. I believe that grief lives in our body, mind, body, and spirit until we begin to work through the grief that we carry. So tonight I would like to, as I always do in my presentation, in my workshops, set the intentions and ground us around this topic as I honor my ancestors. So what I would like for you to do, if you choose to join in with me, you will put your hand right at your heart, right above your belly button. Take one deep breath as I begin to read what you're looking at on the slide, and then I will read it. You take a second deep breath and release, and then we will begin as we ground our attention. So we're going to take one deep breath. And release. I honor my ancestors, yet I am not my ancestors' emotional pain. I am giving myself permission to feel the emotions of grief. Therefore, I will carry my grief differently. I am somebody. I am whole. I am uniquely me, created to be great. And if you participated with me, I want to say thank you for joining me in this grounding exercise as we begin our conversation on grief and managing the emotions of grief. So as we look at the course ahead, these are the things that we would talk about. I have three primary objectives tonight, and one is to define and examine the emotions of grief. The second objective is to identify how unresolved grief impacts the mind, body, and spirit. Thirdly, we will examine ways to face our grief and determine to carry our grief differently. You will also hear from three other young women as a part of our time together tonight that have either experienced this journey of grief recovery with me, or we've collaborated on projects together, and you will hear their voices as we go to the next slide. And so in the way of housekeeping, I feel obligated to tell you I am outside the US doing this presentation. And if for some reason I lose the internet, you will receive a recording of tonight's webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to move to the next slide and introduce you to Janae, which went through life coaching as well as grief recovery with me. And then Paula, you will also hear from her in this next slide. And then we'll talk a little further about the things that you put in the chat box on what is grief and what did all those things that I've experienced have in common.
For me, I didn't understand what grief was. So I identified as like, there was a lot, starting with the struggles of like, where was the anxiety coming from when it came to like certain matters of family issues, or what was this feeling of like wanting to be accepted? Like, I didn't understand any of that was related to grief. And when it came down to pregnancy, I didn't even realize it had anything to do with it. Like, I just knew this was something that I wanted for years and it wasn't happening. And even though I believed God for it, there was always like a sense of doubt behind it. It would be like, oh, if this happens, if God decides to bless us, if it doesn't happen, I'll be fine. But I didn't understand that like there was a lot of things inside of me that was stagnant, that I was suppressing, that was keeping me from being free enough to receive from God anything that came into like the pregnancy round. I know like once me and you did our sessions together and we went on the road of discovery to finding myself and figuring out like all these things about me as far as like, why can't I come up with answers on my own? Why I'm always looking to other people to help me identify things that are wrong with me. What's all this pressure that I'm feeling in my chest, like a tightness when it comes to certain issues. Like, what are these things that I would always say, oh, this is just me, it's just me, but it's grief, a loss that's eating away at me and I had no idea.
So as Janae shared, I will give you the grief recovery method, the Institute definition of grief. Grief is defined as the normal and natural response to a significant loss of any kind. Grief is the normal and natural response to a significant loss of any kind, though we do not treat grief as normal or natural, and our responses are really difficult sometimes around the topic of grief. Grief is the conflict and feeling caused by the end of or change in a familiar pattern or behavior. Grief can be the reality of reaching out for someone who has always been there for you and the realization that they are no longer there. Or the emotion of grief can feel this way. It's the reality of reaching out for someone who has never been there for you, only to find they're still unavailable for you when you need them one more time. And that type of grief I would associate with an absent parent, an absent spouse, those type of grieving situations that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. So Allie, if you would, please, could
For
you,
me, I didn't understand.
sorry, excuse me, can you read some of the responses in the chat box on what is grief and what that all those things have in common that I named earlier?
So for the what all those things have in common, a lot of people said loss and change. Some said loss alone. Someone said overwhelming sadness. Someone else said loss of what is normal or what is common in day-to-day routine. I'm not sure if some of these are answering the first or second question. I know that I think these are answering the first question, sorry. And then someone else said the emotion related to loss. Someone else did ask a question. I'm not sure if you want me to give you that question now or if you want to wait. And then someone else said emotional, physical, and mental pain.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for all the responses. You can go ahead and read that question.
So the question says, if the loss has been caused by suicide, how do you deal with your grief?
So let's proceed through the entire PowerPoint, and I believe the answer you're going to find within what we're going to discuss over the next hour or so. If it doesn't, then we'll circle back to that question, okay? So I'm going to play Paula's reaction to grief and what grief is not what you think it is, but many of the responses that came out of the chat box, if you look at this definition of grief, it aligns quite well with the grief recovery method definition of grief. Normal and natural response to significant loss, and that certainly aligns with some of the things that we just talked about. So we're going to listen to Paula just for a couple of seconds, and then we'll move on.
So it really helped me to unpack, like you said, the emotions and understanding the emotions and knowing that the emotions are real, they're normal. Try not to put them aside, but really deal with them and to be able to speak about them and not feel, sometimes when a person passes away, you feel, or other people feel like, don't talk about it or grieve for a little bit and that's it. But grief is not that way. Grief just, it just sneaks up on you.
Yeah.
You could have a great day one day and an absolute horrible day the next day. You can have a great day one moment and a horrible moment, the next time. Anything could trigger grief. Cleaning a room, hearing a song, a scent, a memory, anything could cause that to actually fester inside of you.
I think what we've already discovered is grief is so much more than death and divorce. Grief is associated with a loss of any kind, loss of job, loss of income, loss of housing. Grief can be both tangible and intangible. Grief is a mixed emotion of all types of feelings that engulf us. Grief is both light and dark, and all of those can absolutely coexist.
So it really helped me to unpack.
So I would ask you if you can identify the many faces of grief in your own life. You can answer that in the chat box, or you can jot that down in your own notes or journal that for yourself. Identify the many faces of grief in your own life. I began by talking about the many faces of grief in my own life personally. And frankly, I did not even realize that those were grieving experiences until the death of my mother, and I felt completely stuck in emotional pain. So is there any response to that, Allie, in the chat box? Okay. We're going to go forward and talk about Dr. A and I collaborated together on a project, and She will speak here in just a second on some of the things that were said to her as she went through the grieving process that quite frankly were not helpful at all. And so the things that we say and do can hinder mental clarity and deepen isolation when someone is grieving. And some of the things that are said or in our own way, get over it or move on. Just give it time. And we know that it's what you do in the time that helps with healing, and that moving on is just not how it works. Telling a young mother who has had a miscarriage that you're young, you can have another baby, or just pray about it. I am a woman of faith, and I believe that we do pray and meditate on the challenges that we have in our life, but there's so much more that has been provided for us to seek help. Telling a mother that you can just adopt when they're experiencing infertility, which is what Dr. Ashford will speak about. You can have another child. Disruption or change in the subject. As you begin to express the emotions about grief, many times people will simply change the subject or begin to talk about their own grieving experience. And in that moment, what is required is that we become a heart with ears as we listen to those that are in pain and need someone to listen and be present with them. I would say that saying nothing is not always the right thing to do. However, if you don't know what to say to a person who's experiencing grief, saying nothing may be the best option. Of course, there's other things that we can say that I will talk about here in just a minute. Consider the myths and misinformation about grief. Grief is not linear, but it's messy. Time does not heal pain. Time just moves. Grief ebbs and flows at will. It has a mind of its own. 1 minute we're fine. The next minute we can be falling apart. Grief shows up differently for everyone. No two people will experience grief the same. There are no stages to grief, but there are similarities. And I'm going to unpack that just a little bit after we listen to this next clip.
Really hopeful for you, but to make other recommendations like, why can't you just adopt? There's millions of children out there that need homes and things like that. I think those types of things they're not helpful.
So some of the things we say are simply not helpful. That's why it suggests that if you're not sure what to say, saying nothing may be the right thing to do. However, there are things that we can say when someone's experiencing grief. Things such as, I am so sorry for your loss. And then listen more to what the person is sharing. Or saying, I am so sorry that that happened to you would be an appropriate thing to say. If someone is experiencing grief and they're in need, offer to bring a meal, dinner to them. Take their kids out for a couple of hours to give them a break. Sit with someone who's experiencing grief and just listen, sharing a cup of coffee. Consider that time does not heal. It's really what we do in the time that helps us heal. So what are some of the things that you have heard or that you have said? Because I'm guilty of saying many of the things that we're talking about before I knew better. And even now, sometimes I have to pause before I speak to make sure that what I'm saying is going to provide mental clarity and help people move from isolation back into a normal part of their lives. So what are some of the things you heard or things that you have said that you now know at this stage in this webinar that are not helpful to say to others? Allie, is there any other comments in the chat box that you can share at this time?
Someone said end of friendships, change of career, not being able to have kids. They said time will heal everything. Someone said it's just a dog.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? What are some of the things you've heard or said? Anything else, Allie?
They are in a better.
Repeat that, please. I think we lost her. Ally? Okay. So
Mhm.
we,
No.
Ally?
Hello?
Yes.
Sorry, I thought I had unmuted myself.
Quite all right. What else do you have?
Someone said they are in a better place. Someone just said talking about your own grief, talking about your own grief rather than just listening.
Yes, yes. And why do we think that happened? Why do we think that happened when we begin to talk about our grief, or when others talk about their grief, others begin to share in their grieving experience? Why do you think that happened? So here's a suggestion. Most of the time, we are uncomfortable with sad or painful situations. And so we will steer clear of anything that's perceived to be negative or sad because we're uncomfortable. We're either uncomfortable or we're not sure what to say. So some of the things that we talked about earlier is, I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry that's happened to you. And the comment, it's just a dog, is a frequent comment. I have heard when my mother died is that she's in a better place. And while as a believer that is very possibly true, it's just not helpful in that moment. And so it's really important to learn the right things to say as we help others move to a place of mental clarity. So telling someone to move on and get over it tends to make the matters worse, not better. And so truly being a heart with ears is the best solution of all, is just to be present and in the moment with a person who is experiencing grief. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. We're going to talk about examining the impact of unresolved grief, physically, socially, and psychologically. And I believe in the clips that you heard from Janae and Paula, you heard an indication of the impact of unresolved grief. And so we know that unresolved grief can lead us to stress situations, anxiety. It creates a sense of isolation because we feel like no one cares and no one understands. Rumination is often a sign of unresolved grief, where people will repeat the same situation or information over and over again, and they're just unable to move beyond that thought. Overeating or no appetite at all is also part of the unresolved grief journey. Some will become physically ill. So unresolved grief can absolutely create physical illness, heart disease, high blood pressure, you name it. It can be associated with unresolved grief in the body because we carry these emotional pains that we've experienced all of our lives in our bodies until we pause to do something about the emotions of grief that we carry. So as we look at mental illness, those who are experiencing mental illness, there may be a delay in response, and the impact can be more severe when someone is experiencing mental illness. The National Library of Medicine tells us that it may provoke psychiatric complications such as major depression. All these are symptoms of unresolved grief and really prolonged grief. Avoidant and coping by self-medicating unresolved grief can lead to misuse of drugs and alcohol and vaping. And the Grief Recovery Institute have what we call STIRBs. STIRBs are just that, short-term energy release and behavior, that a person will involve themselves in drug and alcohol as a way to cope with their grief. Now, much of the work that I do is around normal grief. not the complicated long-term grief, although I have had some clients who've had some long-term grief and have had much success by participating in the Grief Recover program. So as we move forward, we're going to take a look at ways in which we can cope, that will help us cope with our grief. And I really think number one, the first bullet point really kind of speaks to me, and that acknowledge and embrace your emotions. Paula talked about sometimes people will say, just hold it in, just shove it down, be strong for other people. Meanwhile, the person that's actually grieving is absolutely falling apart because it's impossible to be strong for someone else. And embracing our emotions means that I'm going to lean in and allow myself to feel the emotions of grief. So what does that mean? That means that if I need to cry, I will cry. If I need to speak, I will speak. I will not shove down the emotions of grief, because the further you shove that down, the harder it becomes on you and the longer it takes to move to a point of recovery. I absolutely say lean into your faith, your spiritual belief, prayer, meditation, mindfulness, self-care, journaling, deep breathing exercise, outdoor activities. I walk almost daily, and I just absolutely love what nature does to the level of stress that I often will carry. Music, art. I picked up coloring. As my mother was ill and spent time in hospice and in the hospital, I began to color in coloring books, which seemed to have a great impact on me. So what I'd like to say here is not everything works for everyone. Grief is not one of those one size fit all. You have to determine what works best for you. What works for me may not work for you, and what works for your neighbor may not work for you. You have to determine what works best for you. And the best thing to do is to acknowledge and embrace your emotions and begin to move forward and be consistent in whatever you choose that you will utilize to help you cope with grief. Seek professional support. Grief specialist, life coach, mental health provider who specializes in loss, grief, and or trauma. I want to back up for just 1 second here. I wanted to spend some time talking about the fact that grief has no stages. Let's talk about that for a second. One of the things that come up rather frequently for me as I walk alongside of others who are experiencing grief is this notion that grief comes in stages. And so we know that grief does not come in stages. There was a book written some time ago by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that was called The Stages of Death and Dying. And David Kessler came along years later, rewrote a second book, and he named that book The 5 Stages of Grief. And so they collaborated together on that particular project, and the 5 stages of grief seems to have caused quite a bit of stir, because there are no stages to grief, as I spoke about earlier. There are some similarities in what Ross and Kessler write about the 5 stages of death and dying and the emotions that we feel as we go through grief. There is a point where we're in disbelief. And so there are many similarities, but there are absolutely no stages of grief. I had a client once come to me and was very confused and really concerned, because they felt like they were stuck in this stage and not moving forward. They expected that their grief would be over and they would be better. The reality of it is that grief really never ends. It never ends. We feel better, we get better based on what we do with time. We're always going to long for our loved ones. We're always going to wish that they were with us. It lightens as time goes on, as we seek professional help and take the necessary steps forward. But grief absolutely has no stages. And as I pointed out before, it ebbs and flows at will, and it has a mind of its own. And so I wanted to go back to that, talk about that for just a second. Let's talk about the pending holiday that's just around the corner. For many, the holidays are a joyful time of the year. And I can tell you that I have many wonderful memories as a child and memories that I will cherish for the rest of my life. We had the most wonderful Christmas Eves that I can ever imagine, festivities around what we would call the home house with my parents. As you know, I spoke earlier, they're both now deceased. And so as we look at navigating the holidays, here are some suggestions. You take what works for you and apply it to your particular situation. So the first thing I say is do your best not to isolate. It can make you feel worse, not better, to isolate. Honor the people, places, or things that are absent in this season. I honor my ancestors. I honor what my parents did for us, the memories that we have. I honor those as they are absent in this season of Christmas, and not just Christmas, but special days, holidays, birthdays, anniversary, all those times that will come up. Honor their existence and their ongoing presence in your life. Though it's not a physical presence, they will always be with you. So identify the traditions you will keep and create new memories. Decide in advance how and where you will spend your holiday. So as we approach the holiday, I can tell you that we're a blended family. And so we this year have doing something totally different in our holiday than what we've ever done before. Do your best not to overeat or drink, because it will make you feel different, but not better. And when the holiday is over, you will still just feel different, but not better. So avoid overeating and over drinking as much as you can. That can sometimes be hard because the food just keeps coming during the holiday season. Acknowledge and embrace that the holidays and special days are challenging times. Acknowledge and embrace that the holidays and special days can be challenging times. It's very important that we are honest with ourselves about ourselves, that we be honest about our emotions and how we feel, because our healing is wrapped into the ability to be honest with ourselves about how we feel. If you choose to be alone, ask a trusted person to check in on you, or have someone that you can call if you feel like you need to speak to someone. But it's absolutely okay if you decide that you're going to spend the holiday alone. Do not isolate yourself in that process. So as we look at the holidays that are just around the corner, if you take a look at what we've shared here and think about the plans that you have made or not made, and what's going to be healthy for you as you move through the holiday season, it's very important. I wanted to share with you the platform that the evidence-based program is based upon, that I facilitate. I think is necessary to look at the 4 pillars of the grief recovery method and why I believe that it's so effective. This information can be found in the American Journal of Health Education. The grief recovery method is the only evidence-based program in the world that is proven to help relieve the symptoms of grief in the grieving process. So what does it do? It teaches us basic information about grief, coping, and processing grief. It identifies how to confront old myths or unhelpful patterns of grieving. And some of those myths and unhelpful patterns of grieving come from people that we love and that we look up to. And those things are taught to us not because for no other reason other than it's what they were taught, and so it's what they teach. So we identify how to confront those old myths and unhelpful patterns of grieving. The grief recovery method examines ways in which understanding of grief has been developed throughout our lives by important people and society. The behaviors of grief and grief recovery provides action-oriented tasks on how to let go of pain from loss through the timely identification of apologies, forgiveness, and significant emotion statement, and helps reduce the use of short-term energy releasing behavior called STIRBs. And so this is really the basis of the platform in which I facilitate from. It is an evidence-based program. And Allie, is there any other comments before I go any further at any other questions that we can answer before I move to the next slide?
There's no other questions, but they said that triggers can bring out your unresolved grief. And that's what I'm seeing.
Triggers can bring on unresolved grief? Was that the statement, Allie?
Yes, that's the same.
Yes. Thank you for that comment. Certainly do appreciate that. So I would like to share this reflective learning. And because we have a bit of time, we can talk about this, or you can journal this on your own. I've actually created a small journal that you'll be able to download that you can begin to unpack these 2 questions in this journal that's located on my website. So I'm going to listen to Janae here for a second, and then we're going to talk about what are the hidden impacts of grief on our mental wellness journey.
First couple of months of pregnancy is hard. Motherhood is hard. You go through baby blues where you're just crying and you don't know why. Sometimes it's joy, sometimes it's sadness. So then you have your baby blues that nobody tells you about until it hits, and you're like, I don't know why I'm crying. I don't know why I'm crying. I don't know why I'm crying. And they're like, oh, that's just baby blues. Okay, probably should have educated me about that beforehand. But then putting that on top of, I can't walk and I can't do for myself, and I can't take care of this child that I've been waiting for so long. It was a lot on me mentally. So
obviously, Janae is talking about our journey through motherhood. That's just another element of grief that often goes unrecognized. And so if anyone has a response to what are the hidden impacts of grief on our mental wellness journey, and can you now identify the elements of emotional pain you would correlate with loss and grief, and how are you impacted physically, socially, and psychologically by those elements of emotional pain? It's a lot to unpack in those 2 questions. If anyone wants to drop any.
First couple of months of pregnancy is hard. Motherhood is hard.
Excuse me. Anyone want to drop any response to those 2 questions in the chat box? I will circle back on the previous question, Allie, that was asked when we began about suicide. Can you repeat that question for me?
So that question is, 1 second while I get to it. They ask if the loss has been caused by suicide, how do you deal with your grief?
So I would ask from that question, based on the things that we've covered, if we lean into our grief and allow ourselves to feel, I don't know that we would face the grief of suicide any different from grief in general. Some grief may require additional support. And the grief recovery method is an action-based program that will walk you through certain steps of revisiting and completing the communication around the grief that you experience based on suicide. Most of the time, grief leaves us feeling incomplete in the communication with the person that's no longer around. So there's a deep sense of incompletion. And also many things that I hear from others often is there's a guilt that's associated with grief. And so my question is always for the person who talks about guilt as it relates to grief is, did you do anything intentionally to harm the person that's no longer with you? No matter what the circumstances are, the answer is almost always no. We love, we cherish those that are no longer with us. And I don't really have a direct, you do this, this, and this, step 1, 2, 3, other than the fact that we have to go through the grieving process to get to the other side. We have to feel what we feel deeply emotionally to move to the other side. Unfortunately, there is no straightforward way to recover from grief other than to take small, correct actions, one step at a time and one day at a time, knowing that you can move forward. Any other questions?
I just saw someone says, it is embarrassing to have your voice break when you talk about a suicide that happened over 10 years ago. How do you overcome that?
Repeat that, Allie.
They said it's embarrassing to have your voice break when you talk about a suicide that happened over 10 years ago. How do you overcome that?
So it's embarrassing to have your voice break when it's a suicide that happened over 10 years ago. So I'm going to repeat what I said earlier, and that is the fact that grief really never ends. And so that embarrassment, you can feel that way. However, it's normal and natural response is what you're having to the significant loss of suicide from your loved one. And so I would say that do your best to not be embarrassed about the cracking in your voice of a suicide that happened 10 years ago. I've had people in grief recovery that have had situations that are 30 years old, and they're still were working through those grieving experience for 30 years. So it doesn't mean we're going to remain in the same place in our grief for all of our life, but it certainly means that there's hope in taking the next correct step. I would say continue to talk about it. Continue to allow your voice to crack. Continue to express your deep felt emotions. Continue to lean into the situation when it comes up. Let the grief ebb and flow at will. But by all means, seek professional help if you need it. I'm a life coach and a grief recovery specialist, but a therapist is absolutely necessary in prolonged grief. So I hope that helped you in some small way. Any other questions?
There are no other questions right now.
Thank you, Allie. So I am not going to prolong the conversation. What I will tell you is I would ask that if you have learned anything new tonight, that you would drop that in the chat box. And there's 4 ways that you can share your experiences. I am on social media at ALW Coaching. You can be found on Google at Google My Business at AL Woods Coaching. You can drop anything in the chat box tonight that you want to talk about. Above all, and the best possible outcome of this conversation is to help someone else, to talk about the emotions of grief, to normalize the conversation around grief and the impact on our mental wellness within your scope of influence. I do speaking engagement, grief recovery workshop, and facilitate the GRM, grief recovery method, evidence-based educational class. And those come up twice a year. You'll find that on my website. Now, to download the journal that is linked to this talk, you can go to al-woods.com, and you would go to the account tab and enter your information, and you will be able to download a small workbook that unpacks this information that we have covered tonight. So is there any other questions, Allie?
No, there isn't any other questions.
Okay, so I want to say thank you for taking the time to join us tonight, and I certainly appreciate being able to share in this journey with each of you. I wish you well through the holiday season, and please feel free to reach out if you need to speak with me personally. Thank you so much.